Welcome back, 6:33. Rosie and Paul with you here until 10, live across the UK on your TV and your radio.
Yeah, let's have a look through this morning's front pages then. Plans being drawn up to keep supermarket shelves stocked during a possible rail strike, which could be the biggest in modern history. That's according, as you can see there, to The Times.
Let's move to The Guardian, reporting police chiefs will apologise for racism, discrimination and bias within their forces in a new plan that we'll hear more about on Tuesday.
Daily Express leads with the royal family allegedly secretly housing Ukrainian refugees.
And the Eye has PM Boris Johnson and Chancellor Rishi Sunak are facing a mutiny, according to the paper, after the pair were criticised for Britain's ongoing cost of living crisis.
Yeah, let's go through the inside of the papers then with Kevin Schofield and Ella Whelan, both journalists. Start with you, Kevin, I think we'll start with you. Plans are being drawn up to keep supermarket shelves stocked during a possible rail strike. How long is this rail strike going to last then?
Well, the RMT, the Rail Workers Union, are talking about a summer of discontent. So quite a while if they have anything to do with it. Understandably, I guess that it's about pay. Obviously, inflation is heading for 10%. Employers are never going to offer anything like that, so the unions are getting together and saying, right, well, if you don't come up with something at least approaching that type of level, then we're going to take industrial action. Now, I'm old enough to have covered quite a lot of industrial disputes, and you get a lot of this type of sabre rattling. You know, they talk tough, and it's just a way of getting a little bit extra out of employers. So I wouldn't plan at the moment for, I might be proven wrong, of course, but you know, I don't think.
You think this is hot air?
Well, yeah, hot air, sabre rattling, call it what you like, but it's all just part of the process, essentially, of trying to get more money out of the employers. Now, obviously, the government has got to plan for a worst-case scenario, so they're saying, right, well, you know, things are tough enough at the best of times right now, so they're drawing up contingency plans to stop the shelves from being empty, so freight trains would take priority over passenger trains in order to get goods to shops. Now, what also makes it a little bit worrying is that the TSSA union, they are going to support the RMT, so they're drawing parallels with the general strike from the 1920s. Again, you know, I've written these stories before about warnings about this type of thing, and it never comes to pass. So, I mean, it's worth keeping an eye on, but I would say right now it's probably. And I think there's usually a resolution is found before we get to actual strike action.
What do you reckon, Ella? Is the front page of the Times overblowing it a little bit?
I'd say Kevin is probably right in terms of the way in which the tactics of threatened strike action play out. But it is, you know, it is the case that it's a pretty good time to call strike action, because you have a situation in which there is, you know, across various industries, a labour shortage. You've got the inflation rates, which most people sympathise with, in terms of things it being pretty much impossible to get by for many people in the country. And you know, the RMT has got a healthy history of being able to throw its weight around and gain successes. You know, the story on the front page of the paper goes into, you know, the need to stock well in advance, to prioritise freight trains and do all this stuff, which is, we know that the government isn't particularly good at. I mean, not to be cruel, but we've had problems with that in the past. So the idea that Grant Shapps is going to have these kind of emergency meetings with Boris Johnson and the rest of the cabinet, I mean, you know, there's a lot of hot air on both sides, is kind of what I'm trying to say.
Let's move on to the front page of The Guardian. Now, we mentioned it already, but just summarise for us. Police chiefs apologising for racism, discrimination and bias. It might suggest they're not really doing anything right.
Yes, well, so this is, it's kind of a complicated story, because after everyone will remember the murder of George Floyd in America, and the second anniversary of his death is coming up. And in the wake of that, there were kind of mass protests, obviously in America, but as well in the UK, particularly in London, 250,000 people coming out on the streets. And it began a kind of discussion of whether or not the police were going to admit that they were institutionally racist. They had been previously told that they were institutionally racist by the McPherson report, but they claimed that they had moved on from that, and that wasn't the case. So this 50-page report is going to try to go some way to mitigate or assuage people's sort of demands that the police admit they're institutionally racist. They're not going to admit, they're not going to use that term, institutionally racist, but they said that they're going to vow to end the treatment that black people find stigmatising and humiliating, and that kind of, and you go inside the Guardian, that extends. And the thing is, this is just really, I think a lot of people are going to find this pretty insulting, because on the one hand, what good does it do when police officers apologise for things and in this kind of superficial way? But this news comes, less than a week after the discussion from Priti Patel to suggest that she's going to change stop and search rules. The law around stop and search, particularly this one clause of it which says that instead of the police needing to find evidence that there will be violence, they just need to find evidence that there may be the threat of violence, which, lots of people, not least leaders of, black campaigners or black communities have said, this is just a way for the police to be able to completely ramp up stop and search in an unmitigated way. And it's, talk about, they quote here the testimonies telling us that black people find these encounters particularly stop and search, confrontational, stigmatising and humiliating. I mean, save the apologies. Just do something concrete in terms of if you think that part of the problem with racism in the police is to do with stop and search, change the policy. I think a lot of people will be rolling their eyes at this.
Do you think the apology is superficial?
I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to say superficial, but yeah, it's the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I mean, it's one thing to say, to apologise. It's another thing to actually back that up and actually prove it with your actions. And we've seen this time and time again.
How could they do that?
Well, by behaving better. I mean, Ella mentions the McPherson report, which is true. That did accuse them of being institutionally racist, and yet here we are, however many years later, and yet we're still seeing the same stories again and again and again. So, it garners the police reasonable headlines on the front page of the Guardian, but what you don't want is to be here again in 5 years' time with yet more scandals and yet more examples of the police actually being racist. So the other neat little bit of spin I saw in the stories, they don't want to say they're institutionally racist, but they're pledging to be institutionally anti-racist. Well, I mean, as I say, that is a little bit of a neat PR spin.
Are we too quick sometimes to bash the Met, though? Because obviously these things do happen, but they are a minority of police officers, and sometimes it can feel like, because everyone in the media is talking about it, that the problem is greater than it actually is. I have a friend who's a serving police officer, and she says that morale at the moment is really, they feel like they are under pressure all the time from their bosses, from the media, and that sometimes we don't pay enough attention to the good work that they do.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that they are rightly held to a very high standard. They have a lot of power over people's liberties, and it is important, I think, from a journalistic point of view, that we highlight examples of where things go wrong, in the hope that it encourages them to be better going forward.
But should we also highlight when things go right and the good work that the police does? I know that it is the way we think as journalists.
Yeah.
We don't tend to report the good stuff. News tends to be bad. That's just how we think.
There isn't very much good stuff at the moment, because if you look at I read a story the other day that said that the rate of crimes that are solved is like in single figures, percentages, and we know that, to pick one example, prosecution of rape cases is, nowhere near what it should be, and it's abysmal. And so, you have this situation in which I get kind of bored about whether it's, of the discussion of bad apple in the cart versus the whole cart being rotten. But, if you have a situation which, for example, in Hackney where I live, police officers are going into schools, strip searching a young black person, because of an allegation of having marijuana on her. I mean, what do you take from that, other than, is that one person deciding, I'm going to strip search a young black kid today, or is it a policy within the police that gets okay? I think it's a bit silly to suggest that people are just free agents when they're in the police force, acting on their own volition. They are held to a high standard. They are also trained to do what they're commanded to do. So if there is a problem, it isn't usually just with individuals. It usually goes up the chain of command, and that's an important thing to investigate.
Yeah, do let us know what you think about that, by the way. gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Let's move on, shall we? They've sort of dodged the front pages, but this time yesterday, Partygate, the polling of the Prime Minister, was very much front and centre. There are indications, aren't there, Kevin, that if there was a next general election call quite soon, Boris Johnson might not fare that well.
Yeah, well, he does seem to have dodged a bullet on Partygate, only getting one fine. But I think probably the issue that is probably more interesting to people and certainly affects more people is the cost of living crisis. And right now, the government is a bit like a rabbit in the headlights. They don't seem to have a plan for dealing with it. They know that something needs to be done, but they can't really decide what it is. And people notice this. People notice that their bills are going up. They notice that their weekly food shop is now 20% higher than it was this time 6 months ago. And they're looking for the government to actually do something. Now, up until now, the government have said, well, look, we did a £9 billion package in February. There'll be more help coming in the autumn. But that leaves 6 months in between when people's bills are going up. Their wages aren't keeping up with inflation, and they're sick to death, really, of an apparent briefing war between the Treasury and Number 10 as to what they're going to do. There's talk of a windfall tax. There's talk of tax cuts, maybe increasing benefits. But, it seems as though there's a sort of paralysis at the heart of government, and they're not actually just taking a decision.
Do you think that paralysis extends to the opposition as well?
No, not necessarily. I mean, there's only so much that the opposition can do. Obviously, they've been pushing for a windfall tax for quite some time, and ironically, I guess that's probably why we don't have one yet, because the government, as much as I speak to Conservative MPs, and they're instinctively against raising taxes, but at the same time, they look at the huge profits that the energy firms are making and say, actually, there is an argument for a tax, use the money to bring people's bills down, but the politics of it is, well, we don't want to give Labour a PR victory. So, that is maybe explains part of their reluctance. But I think it is going to happen, and they might as well just, do it.
Yeah, you say Conservative MPs are instinctively against tax cuts, but...
rises.
Tax rises, but Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak are obviously, they're looking at the highest tax burden this country's faced since the Second World War. So what would you say, Ella, when it comes to how you deal with this cost of living crisis? Is this about tax cuts, or is this about a windfall tax, or both?
Well, I mean, the thing is, the point to make about the windfall tax is it's incredibly small fry. I mean, really, in the grand scheme of things, it's become this sort of, as many things do in Parliament, it's become this kind of football that's thrown between the two parties, and you're not doing enough. And when you actually investigate what the windfall tax would mean for, every household in the UK, it's peanuts. It really goes nowhere near doing anything towards the, for example, the news coming up that energy bills might go up to £2,600. I mean, and so a few £100 from a windfall tax is going to do nothing. There is that,
Just on Kevin's point, how much do you think PR is playing sort of havoc with actually just dealing with the crisis?
A huge amount. I mean, we know that if you watch PMQs, for example, and you've got a serious, as much as I think the Labour Party's got problems with its ability to talk about gender and things like that, you've got questions levelled at the Prime Minister of how you're going to deal with the fact that people are not just struggling but floundering. That there's whole, and not just the poorest, but across the board, people are suffering. And he turns around and says, well, why would I take a question from you and you don't know what a woman is? And it's like, hang on a minute, this isn't a game anymore. We all know that the Labour Party's got a problem with what we're talking about women. Why don't you answer the question on the cost of living crisis? So there is, I think, in particular, Boris Johnson has and Rishi Sunak are in a, Kevin used the word paralysis. I think that's a very good descriptive word for it. But I think it's a studied paralysis. It's a means of sort of saying, maybe if we just do nothing, things will sort of figure itself out. They're blaming Russia and what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. Okay, that's part of it. They're blaming the pandemic. Okay, that's part of it. But also the government made certain decisions throughout the pandemic that it could have done differently in relation to opening up and closing down society. And they're kind of, at the end of the day, they stood there saying, well, it's not really my problem. Don't really know what to do with it. And that's not on. Citizens shouldn't take that from a government that says they are literally briefing papers and saying, we are at a loss, we have no options. That's nonsense. They do have options.
So just to very quickly to finish your initial point, which was you were talking about the windfall tax raising a modest amount at best. Are you then talking about tax cuts in addition to that windfall tax?
Well, there are certain obvious things, like, the welfare system in this country is meant to be a safety net, and it's not functioning as a safety net at the moment if it can't, it doesn't keep up with inflation. So on the basic level, you need to increase increase things like, universal
Upgrade
credit.
benefits.
And you need to do that. But also, as well as the short-term issues, which are very, I think they should just, the magic money tree that Rishi Sunak found throughout the pandemic needs to be rediscovered and shook a bit, quite simply. But also there needs to be a longer-term discussion about what is it in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years that the government's going to do? What are the big ideas for innovation and production and all those things that the economy has needed for decades?
Just saying we need to look short-term and
long-term. Stop
Ella, Kevin,
fiddling while Rome burns.
very much. You're going to be with us this morning, keeping us company on breakfast to go through some of the stories inside the papers. And as Paul mentioned, please do join the conversation as well. GBViews at gbnews.uk.